So we talked about the freezing, and that this is a difficult word for me to pronounce, the threat anticipatory freezing moment, which is highly functional where there is a kind of balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, and there is also the freeze, so to speak, the tonic immobility freeze, the freeze where you don't perform well. What are the characteristics of that? Is that a high heart rate or low heart rate variability? Can you just give a little explanation of what happens there?
Yeah. So the good freeze, threat anticipatory freezing, there we have unique features where the pupils are dilated, so bigger pupils, the skin conductance is high, so the sympathetic arousal, but there's also a dominance in the parasympathetic arousal, so the net heart rate is low.
Yeah.
Unique feature is that your heart rate is really low and that you're hyper alert and you're not moving. So how is that different from fright? So I would call it fright. There you can see all kinds of behaviors. So they can move, there can be even uncontrolled movements or strange habitual actions, or not moving at all, but for example, crying or saying things, or the heart rate is not low. Often it's actually high. So it doesn't have this unique profile that we see during threat anticipatory freezing. It's actually a mixed bag of panic-like behaviors, uncontrolled panic-like behaviors. So whereas you have these really nice automatic defensive reactions like freezing, low heart rate, or the action mode, fight or flight, those are the automatic things that you can have. During fright, somebody is overwhelmed and is not under control, and it could look like panic, that could have many manifestations.
And there are many questions popping up right now, like what are the personal or factors making people more vulnerable to this? I think you, in your freeze research, I'm not sure, is this a thing some people are more vulnerable to, like personality characteristics, or is it just
Actually, in the literature, there's hardly any good prospective research into fright or choking under pressure. So this fright part, it's really hard to investigate in a proper fashion, because it's hard to bring people in that state in an ethical way. We know from war situations, and we also know from real life threatening situations, that this can happen. It's really hard to elicit it for investigations. So, but you rely on self-reports then, and for the threat anticipatory freezing, we can really measure it. And what we know is that those people who show this tonic immobility or fright, whatever you want to call it, they have a higher chance of developing post-traumatic stress symptoms. That is what we know. But we don't know, it's hard to predict who gets it. Plus, I think it's also important, everybody can maybe get it, depending on the situation. So a situation can be so overwhelming that this could happen to people because it triggers something. And then the question is, how do you get somebody out of that? And there are those steps that we were discussing before are very important. One is really making contact with the person, making sure that that person does a very simple task, like telling their name or telling, where are you? That's something that they can respond to, asking a simple question, making contact, touching the person. There's many steps that you can take to get somebody out of it. But the important thing is to bring the person back in the here and now, and requesting a very simple first task of the person.
Yeah.
And it could be one button press, or squeeze me in the arm, or say your name, so that they do something that occupies their working memory for a moment.
Yeah.
That is very important, because what we have seen in the scanner, what we've seen during threats, we get a shift. During stress, we get a shift in large-scale networks in the brain. And what you have to do is simply activate again those networks that you get activated when you do something. So simply asking, and that occupies the working memory a little bit. Simply asking a simple task is enough.
And do you think, maybe this is a more not a very scientific question, but can you recognize by yourself when you are in a fright situation, and can you get out of it by yourself, so to speak? Because I know, for example, from anxiety, and that when people get panic or anxiety, there are some tools they learn, and I do this with clients as a psychologist. For example, to come here in the here and now, to place their feet firmly on the ground, or it doesn't matter, but to come in the here and now. But is it for a fright situation, do you think it's possible to get out of it or recognize it yourself? Do you need the help of others?
Yeah, so I think panic patients know exactly what we were talking about, because they often have this, patients with panic disorders, of course. Yeah, and you can teach people to see it coming. There are always anticipatory signals. The first panic attack is always feels as overwhelming, and you didn't see it coming. But once you have been in a situation more often, people learn, they actually start to avoid any trigger.
Yeah.
But you can teach people to see it coming. And then, of course, once you're there, you can teach them things like breathe out, or give them the reminder to the game that we were talking about, to the situation of the game. So if you see it coming earlier, and that's why we actually give this training first, the triggers, so that we hope actually that we can avoid this overwhelming situation. And when you see it coming, you can already tell yourself, okay, breathe out. Okay, and now action again.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, there can be situations where you get overwhelmed and where you get into this fright. And if you cannot get out of it yourself, it's fantastic if there's somebody else who just helps you to come back by asking simple questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in the trauma literature, there is a lot of talking about this, about the effects of freezing in incidents, and what to do next, and what happens in your body, in your mind. And another question I have, this maybe a little bit of topic of this, but in police training, I think more in training. So in folk literature, there was a long time we talked about the triune brain, where we had the brainstem, then we had the limbic system, then we had the cortex, so it's kind of three-part brain thing. And we used it as a model, and so on and so on. And the amygdala was the end and the beginning of all of this. Then the research of Dr. Lisa Feldman-Barrett came with how emotions are made, and their research about how emotions are constructed, and so on and so on. And she just devastated the work of Paul Ekman and everything we talked about in the brain. But so we had a kind of language when we talked about stress, and it circled a little bit around. We have the cortex, then we have the amygdala, and then we have the brainstem, and the amygdala does the fight, flight, and so on, and the cortex brings you back online. But what is, without becoming too nerdy about it, but is amygdala still playing a big role in all this, or are there other?
Wait, I have to. Well, it's definitely that the amygdala still plays a big role in it, but it's a very simplistic view on the brain to think that there are three structures.
Yeah.
And I think brain scientists know that this is a language that can be used to explain it to practitioners.
Yeah.
It's not the language that we use as brain scientists. We know that there are large-scale networks and that many structures are involved in many tasks. So it's very simplistic to talk about three particles in the brain. And I always think, not everybody has to be a brain scientist. So the language we use, I think sometimes it matters, but what do I think of this? Well, if people start to talk about these centers, like the emotion center and the control center, I think, well, maybe that is for sometimes it's enough, but I'm always immediately alerted, like, okay, this is my brain scientist, because we would never talk about it that way. We know that there's not a control center and that there is an emotion center.
But for us trainers, it is important in a way to, we like to have a kind of model to share with our participants, like, this is how it works and this is what you can do about it. But maybe you are saying it doesn't matter what happens I'm not sure, but maybe they don't need the knowledge at all.
Well, trainers sometimes hope that there is an all-over theory where everything matches, but reality is more complicated. And the question is, do we want to study reality? Yes, as scientists, we want to study the complexity, because that helps us to get better and more fine-tuned trainings. So a while ago, nobody thought of freezing, threat anticipatory freezing, as a good thing. So because we really looked into details and had very refined experiments, we could show that it's actually a good thing and not a bad thing. So I think that is important. But if you want to train somebody how to deal with reality, then it doesn't matter how it works exactly in the brain. I think one thing that I can say is the onset of freezing during acute threat, the onset of freezing is really something that happens in the midbrain, in these structures that you were talking about. It's the amygdala that talks to a structure called the periaqueductal gray. It's a really low level. With only 2 or 3 steps, we are already inhibiting motor neurons in the spinal cord. So this is really a low level motor inhibition. It's immediately there. It's very rapid, and the parasympathetic nervous system plays a role, and those low-level brain structures play a role. That's for the onset of the freezing. That we know. But then, how do you decide to stay in freezing? In this threat anticipatory freezing. And there we see that many structures start to play a role. So we entrain actually this with our breathing rates, and we can stay in this freezing. And those are the neural structures that are also implicated when we actually voluntarily want to go into this state of freezing. So snipers do that, or living statues, they actually engage those brain structures to get into this state of freezing. And that is also in animals and humans, the way to stay into freezing. And then how do you decide to move from threat anticipatory freezing to action? Those are also things we kind of know by now. We know which neural structures are involved in switching from freezing to action. Flexibly shifting between these modes is essential.
Voluntary is.
Yeah, well, we do it on the basis of all kinds of computations. The voluntariness can actually vary. Because we are actually very good in it. When we are crossing a street, we have to decide, do I wait? And all of a sudden a car is coming. you have to make a split-second decision in, am I going to cross the street or will I wait? You see the car coming, and we are, I think on a daily basis, we are in situations where we have a transient freezing and we have to decide to move to action or not.
Yeah.
And where we have to make action decisions. That happens all the time, also during sports.
Yeah.
Do we go or do we not go? Do Peter, what is he going to do? During penalties. I mean, there's so many daily life situations where we do this. And we're not always consciously doing this. Our brains are constantly making computations about what are the gains and the losses, risk assessments, for fight or flight, for going or not.
Yeah.
And these computations are optimized during a state of freezing. That we know now. We do a lot of computational work where we look at brain structures, which brain structures are involved in making these computations. And our brains are constantly doing that. And they're not necessarily doing that consciously. So all these things we can do while we're doing something else. So that is actually interesting, right?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And should we as trainers, no, this is no, I don't want to lay the responsibility on your shoulders, but when I heard you talking about this and writing about this, I thought, should we talk to officers or other first responders about the positive freeze, so to speak, about the threat anticipatory freeze moment as being a good thing to be in, depending on the circumstances, the time, and so on. Is this something? Is this a message for our trainers and first responders to educate?
In fact, I've been doing this all the time, already from 2010 on. I'm collaborating with the police, and that's also the reason why we get these big grants and why we do all this research together with the police.
Yeah.
Because it does appeal to them.
Yeah.
And they understand, they recognize the situations, and we can give language to what they observe and what they want to train. That's actually the reason why we're now even implementing this training in the curriculum.
Yeah.
Because it is something they recognize and they can work with. But I agree with you, it's important to talk that there's a lot of discussion between scientists and practitioners. I think it's so important. And what I like so much about the police is that they are willing to see the complexity.
Yeah.
They are open to say, oh, okay, so it's not just control and emotion. It's a little bit more complicated. And what my experience is with the police is that they are very open to listen, and we are very open to hearing their stories. And together, that's how we got to this game, because they explained their problem to us. We explained what we had seen, and that's how we got together. This was really a product we made together.
Great.
It's actually one of the police officers who is the voice in the game, who's telling them, okay, now pay attention to this. So it's a completely joint product, and that's really nice.
That's
and
great.
Yeah, completely agree with you. We should talk more. And I am always thinking, well, when they use the word freeze for choking under pressure, then I have to, should I say so? Because it's really messing up the literature if we do that. And I always think, well, it has to remain practical for the police practice. And if this is the term, fine. I'm not going to make a fight about a term. But it can make things confusing if you want to make it more evidence-based. Because then you go into the wrong literature.
Yeah, it's true. I think that's what happened, because if you talk to a regular officer or emergency medic, whatever, and you talk about freeze, they immediately associate it with doing it. There are some sayings also in our circles, like do something instead of nothing. Like, like you have to do something, because freezing is the better thing you can do. So that there is a kind of narrative around it.
Yes, but maybe that is also the narrative that prevents police officers from really being reflective and a little bit less stigmatizing stress reactions. And that is a second mission I have. I think it's so important that in the police we find ways to make it a little bit more open to discussion, that it's actually fine that you have a stress reaction. And I think it would help them if they would all embrace the fact that it's so normal to have stress reactions and that it's no problem that you have them. It's simply what we have. Only when you're open to that, then you can start to train and to optimize them. And by giving them the examples showing that freezing is a good thing, maybe they also become a little bit more open to communicating about it and to helping each other in these situations. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to gain there in the police. So this whole macho culture, of course, doesn't work in the end. That is not going to help us to improve decision-making under stress. We have stress reactions, they're very helpful. We wouldn't survive without them. They're very important and usually they work fine. It's just that they have to work in extreme situations and then you have to depart from the stress reactions and use them to make it a little bit better. And for that, you need to actually make a word like freeze a positive thing, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Karin, for all your work and the explanation. Did I forget to ask something which is important to you and what you want to give people?
No, I think we discussed a lot. I hope I didn't talk too much. Once you get talking, I come up.
That was the purpose.
I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, me also. So I will close this and then come back to you.